right. Good morning, and hopefully you all were in the previous session and have the, I guess, fear and opportunity well shook into you already. Clearly there is a lot to talk about, and happy Chinese New Year. That just happens to be today. The year of the pig, somewhat ironically, and as we know in China, crisis means opportunity. So much going on, and we'll try to really just tackle a few of the topics. And I think starting out, how many of you think that U.S. pork exports will be record large this year? Anybody? And is that because of China? Skeptical, that's good. Okay. Well, we're going to try to really dive into four what I see as key areas and for similar reasons in most cases. But China, obviously, ASF, and tariffs. We know talks are going on. At some level, they were in D.C. right last week. They'll be in China again, trying to work toward this March 1 deadline. And a 62% tariff on U.S. pork in China today changes the landscape regardless of ASF. In Europe, we have ASF as well. We're going to touch on what's happening over there. And then Brexit, which is really hard to fathom, but I'll just show the trade between the UK and Europe and possible chaos on a lot of pork. Mexico, as you know, our biggest market, we still have that 20% tariff. Touch on that. Japan, we don't have a trade agreement. Everyone else does. In effect, December 30th and February 1. Big problem in our big value market. And then there's a lot of the world still out there, which we'll just barely touch on, especially on Korea at the end. But I'm kind of setting those aside because essentially demand remains strong. We'll continue to do more business in these markets, but it really depends on everything else that we already mentioned. And the global economy, which I'm not going to get into either. And so before August, before ASF broke in China, USDA was saying global pork production is going to set another record again this year, and that growth really largely being led by the U.S., especially if we look at the major exporters, which I'll show in a minute. But so when ASF broke, we started looking at scenarios. Well, you know, is it a 10% drop in China's production? What does that look like? And I'm kind of have just stuck with 10%, realizing, especially after spending a little bit of time with Dr. Spronk, that 10% is like, it'll be way beyond that and longer term. So, I mean, the transformation in China is it's not really fathomable. But I've stuck with 10% because really, honestly, when you get beyond this, who knows? It's like too wild to forecast. And it will come down to price and whoever's willing to bid. And you're going to have a hit on pork consumption, which we'll get into a little bit, because of price, not because of consumer fears. And so, yeah, a 10% decrease in China is a 4% drop globally. It's obviously a game changer in itself. And for the major exporters, Europe, basically production continues. It was record large last year. It will be record large again this year. Whenever they call for a slowdown in Europe, they still manage to somehow produce the same or more pork. So call Europe production steady to slightly higher. And of course, we know we're producing record volumes here in the U.S. And then you see the other major exporters, they look rather small, right? So this is important when we think about who is going to fill the China hole. And that's why I'm saying the drop of 10%, I can get us there, and we'll talk about that. But beyond that, I don't know. And so what I did in the 10% too is looking back what happened before. So the last time we saw China really come in and buy was 2016. And we'll talk about the impact on U.S. hog prices in a minute too. Back in 2016, it was a restructuring thing. So China's producers have been losing money, and the government said, look, we have these new environmental laws. We want to move pork production away from the cities, away from the water. It's going to happen. And so you had this restructure shift, drop in China's production, and growth in imports. That's 2016. That increase was 1.5 million tons. So we know that has happened in the past, and I can get us there again this year to help fill part of that 10% drop in China's production, and it's still offset partly by a decrease in Chinese consumption. And so Europe is set up really well to, again, be the biggest supplier into China, and then how much the U.S. supplies again, depends on those tariffs and whether the retaliatory tariffs come off of our product. Canada's supplies are relatively constrained, and I'll show you what they've been doing so far. They're going to continue to ship less to the U.S. They have been doing less to China, but they can do more into China. Brazil has been just shoveling the product into China because they didn't have Russia. Now Russia has approved, again, a handful of Brazil's plants, and so that could be interesting, but expect Brazil to continue to really shift more and more into China. They have on the beef side as well. Chile, marginal supplier. And what does this look like globally? So China was the real driver in 2016. On global, these are the top exporter shipments to the world, and that would be the case again this year, and it would drive global trade up about 18%, again, to meet that assumed shortfall in China, driving trade to closer to 10 million tons, up from the 8 million ton mark this past year. And of course, China is already the largest importer of pork in the world. And I have China and Hong Kong separate there just because the scale gets really out of whack if you add them together. But obviously, they imported over 3 million tons of pork and variety meats last year. And whenever China comes in and buys big, we see them kind of taper off. As you see, they've reduced year on year. But compare that back to 2013, which is your blue line, and they always jump to this new higher plateau. And so we've seen that in the past, and I think the other underlying thing with what this disease is going to do is completely transform the industry. It's also going to transform their consumption. And Dr. Spronk mentioned they're a chilled market, and that is true. I mean, most of their pork consumption, 70% or more, is still fresh product. But this disease should also change that. It should shift them to a more modernized market and more chilled product, partly because the production should move away from the cities, the big commercial operations, and the plants should be there and they should be shipping pork, chilled pork, which is not the case today. So kind of mind-boggling, but China should continue to import, obviously, huge volumes, even through the shakeup, and partly because it's going to take a while, obviously, with this disease, to find some kind of sustainable production managing around, as Dr. Spronk said, the 4 diseases. Okay, and so if we look at, this is pork exports to the rest of the world outside of China. You can see that trade is relatively flat, although there was an uptick in 2017 and kind of holding steady now. And so it looks like, wow, China's the only growth market out there. But that's sort of masked because we have seen growth in these other key importing markets, but it's basically offset your drop or your loss of Russia and Ukraine there on the end, who compared to 2013 essentially aren't buying anymore. So closed market in the case of Russia, they banned suppliers based on ractopamine issues, and then of course we have the food embargo under which all major suppliers except Brazil were under as of August 2014 related to Ukraine sanctions. And then they also kicked out Russia December 2017 and then added a few plants just this past December. So Russia has been managing with ASF. They're actually growing production. They're nearly self-sufficient, as you can see, but it's been a closed market. So that's been part of how they've dealt with it. And their consumers have frankly suffered, but we have seen transformation in Russia's production and industry, and they want to export. That's their goal now, is Russia wants to export. They need to export pork. Okay, so basically, that 1.5 million ton increase to China can largely come from Europe, and I'll show you a little bit more again on Europe, but that would drive Europe's exports to 4.45 million tons. This includes variety meats. That would be a 27% increase, and this is assuming that we are stuck with tariffs. So this changes if U.S. tariffs go away tomorrow or March 1. Again, Canada hasn't been expanding like we have been, so we've seen it this past year. Their exports were basically flat overall, and there was some shifts, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But the exportable supplies really come out of the U.S. and Europe. And Europe is partly able to export because they're domestic. The intra-EU demand is not great. And so that's another thing that is really frustrating is that you look at Europe's ag outlook, and it's all about the challenges of, around the negatives associated with meat consumption and the threats to alternative meats, and we see that here. We're very concerned about it here, Europe for sure as well. And so a huge consumer market that they're struggling. Pork's still their biggest consumed meat, but they have the exportable supplies because that intra-demand is not great. And for the U.S., we are a key supplier in the rest of the world. So Latin America, obviously massive for us with Mexico, but also, the growth into Colombia, Central and South America. And so we should continue to grow in those markets. Again, price being key here. And obviously Korea and Japan. That's the other fear. All of these neighboring countries to China are scared to death that it gets to their herds, and it will wipe them out. If it gets to South Korea, if it gets to Taiwan, it will just destroy those herds. And especially in the case of Taiwan and Vietnam, these countries are highly self-sufficient. And so imports are important, but they also produce, 80% of their consumption. So if it wipes out those herds as well, then really all bets are off as far as what happens. And Southeast Asia as well. We've seen record imports in the Philippines. Touched on Vietnam already, but Philippines is the big market down there, and they imported record volume of pork again last year. We all supply into that market, but also bear in mind, especially in the case of Korea, these importers see African swine fever in Europe, and it scares them. And so we already have a little bit of a preference here in the Americas of being, safe. And so that's been a tailwind, I think, arguably already, and that continues as far as us being able to grow in the rest of the world. So I can get U.S. exports up 15% even under a tariff scenario. So that tells you that that's from a 5% baseline without ASF in China. And then it just gets wild after that. But we should have way more upward potential, especially if retaliatory tariffs are removed in China and, importantly, in Mexico. And it's a margin thing, especially in the case of Mexico, where we are paying the tariff. You guys, as producers, are paying that tariff. And I'll show you a little bit on that. Okay, and so what's the market telling us? Hog prices around the world as of December were low. They were low compared to the 5-year average for December, and lower year on year in basically all of the world, importers and exporters. Your exceptions are Taiwan holding in there, and then Vietnam, because they already cycled. So they overproduced last year, and China also had lower prices last year. And this year, Vietnam came into that short end of their cycle, and so that's why their prices are stronger. And we did see, U.S. growth in shipments to Vietnam this past year. But otherwise, you see weak prices, and it's like the calm before the storm. Like everyone, we don't really know what's happening in China, but we know it's, out of control in a sense. But the markets are waiting to, show me. And China, we'll talk more about their prices being low as well. U.S. hog futures, you all know this better than me, but the market was pricing in, I would say, that export premium for a while, and then those premiums have essentially been erased. And so I pulled this last week, and so the market is saying, we trade in there kind of, if you will, along the seasonal. The other thing to note here is kind of interesting if we think about, so I said in 2016 was the last time China came in and bought really big from the world. Well, you recall where U.S. hog prices were in 2016, they're kind of like normal. And we know we had record production that year. And compare that to PED, which really drove our prices through the roof on not that much actually of a production change. So we also have to keep in mind that the China production situation, that impact on our market is not as certain. Our market went much more crazy on the uncertainty of what was happening here than on China's buying back in 2016. So take it as you will, but just kind of an observation. All right, we'll talk specifically about China, and Randy Spronk came and gave actually 2 excellent presentations because he had to sit in for Dr. Liz Wagstrom because she couldn't make it. But we do this swine industry symposium. This was the 7th one that we've done. We partner with U.S. Grains and U.S. Soy, and it's really a capacity building effort. So trying to collaborate with Chinese. So we have Chinese partners in this. So the China Meat Association, China Animal Agriculture, and Chamber of Commerce partner with us as well. And so we tackle kind of the topics of the day. So last year was like manure management. These are quite detailed. And this year, of course, was animal disease. And so instead of happening in the fall, it was moved to January to accommodate all of this. But Randy gave a great talk on just explaining what you all do on biosecurity. And as Dr. Frank, as Gordon was saying, they don't have that knowledge in China. And so they're kind of, crying out for help because the government's it's not working. And so I think that there was some real light shed, and hopefully it gets to some key people besides those just in the room. But on telling them how we're planning and how we've managed through PED in the U.S. We also had a European speaker that's a pork producer from the Iberian Peninsula and was part of eradicating it there in Spain back in the 80s and 90s. And so it was really impactful program, and hopefully had some longer or bigger effect. But we also got to have some meetings with the trade and try to understand a little about what was happening briefly in our time in Beijing, and still hard to understand all of it. But I think this is one of the charts from one of our meetings, right, Randy, on the Boyer estimates about how pork is moved across China, and the reason pork is moved across China. And so it's kind of a lot going on. But basically the red provinces are those that export pork. So they're pork surplus, the red and the pink. And then the blue areas are those that have to import pork, so pork deficit. And you know that the populated areas, so along the eastern seaboard, the coast there, obviously they have to bring in pork. And then in the north, where the virus first was found, they're surplus. And so as they told Randy and I, they're producers are culling, so whether or not they have the disease, they're scared, and so they're culling, and they may have it, and they're culling. And so what's happening to this product? Well, as they said, we have cold storage in China, but it's for imported product. It's not for domestic. And so it's sitting outside if it's far enough north, because it's cold enough right now. But this has been part of the problem, and like Gordon was saying, it's also led, you can understand, into some movements that are not supposed to happen, because it's caused these shifts in prices, or this price spread. So if I'm in Lianlang, way up north in the pink area, my price is less than 60 cents a pound. And if I'm in Sichuan, which is an importing region, or in Guangdong and Zhejiang, they're on the coast, the importing areas, my prices are much higher. So over $1 a pound to $1.20. And in some cases higher year on year, versus in the north where prices are down 72% year on year. So you're going to have some illegal movement because the market is so much higher in an area that needs the product. And so it's really complicated the situation and caused huge distortions in the market, and difficult to sort out what all is happening. But this can also lead to transformation in, as I was saying, in China's consumption, essentially, as well as they relocate to where the government had wanted them, away from the urban areas. They're going to have to hopefully start shipping chilled pork rather than running hogs all over the country. And again, prices are low at the moment, and so we were talking a little bit about this last night, but this is really another indicator that they have a lot of inventory, supplies that they're trying to cram through right now. And Randy and I heard this as well, is that the hole in China's supplies, it's going to take a while for us to see that. And I think that's kind of the pause in the markets, everyone kind of waiting for this storm. But they have a lot of product to eat through right now, and pigs that are waiting to be killed, waiting to move, whatever, but also product that's sitting somewhere and trying to get through the system at the moment. And prices were still sliding lower ahead of Chinese New Year as of yesterday, and that really only happens when you have a surplus situation, as we've seen in the past. And if we don't see the market jump after Chinese New Year, then they're definitely still burning through these supplies. And so, of course, everyone's trying to guess when the hole actually hits. And we heard later in the year, so maybe late Q2, maybe not even until Q3, because there is so much to get through. We also know that chicken prices, and we heard a few different figures, but that live chicken prices had tripled. The broiler price, this is MARA, or official Chinese data, which I had stopped looking at for a while because it was just useless. But as an indicator, prices for broiler meat are record high right now. And we know from our staff on the ground that canteen feeding or institutional feeding, catering, those that need a cheaper ingredient, but also a safe ingredient that people aren't going to question, they shifted immediately to poultry. We think, at least from our guys on the ground, the fear about ASF, it already happened. Like maybe in August, the local areas, there was some impact on consumption because I didn't know what this disease was. But it's been months now, nobody's died, it's okay. They're not worried about eating pork now. It's purely on the supply side. But we do see record high broiler prices, and this comes in because when we think forward, that drop in China's production, whatever it ends up being, it's not going to be filled. Like that will be a drop in consumption. And so there's only so much we can offset with poultry and pork, and how much pork China produces is a whole other question. But I've just taken their official latest census or NBS statistics on Chinese pork per person here, and you can see that pork consumption had already been trending a little bit lower. And so on the 10% decrease, that's the numbers I'm showing here. So your total meat consumption will continue to trend lower this year. If it's more than 10% drop, I think the bigger impact is going to be next year, not so much this year. But that will continue to trend lower because globally we just can't offset. And so the imported share of this is shown in the red at the top. And I can get close to 3 kilos per capita on imported, which would be by far the biggest. Imports were about 2.25 kilos per capita in 2016. And so imports certainly having to take up a bigger share of China's consumption, but we're not able to offset that drop. So you assume that drop is bigger, that will be a bigger drop in Chinese consumption. Only offset to how much, to the degree they're willing to pay to pull product away from everyone else. Okay, so that takes us into Europe. Again, Europe is the biggest supplier of pork to China, and Europe obviously is battling their own issues with ASF, and I don't know how well that shows up, but this is the European Commission's regionalization. ASF is kind of unique because it is OIE reportable disease, but you're kind of on your own as far as setting up your regionalization, and then you share that with the OIE, and they can publish, but that doesn't mean endorsement. And then you really just need to negotiate with your trading partners of whether that's acceptable. So we still import pork from Poland, and USDA suspended those imports in October briefly to negotiate, to work out which plants they were concerned about, some that were, they thought, too close to these ASF areas. And so it's interesting how the OIE has managed this disease. But the Commission has set up their zoning in these 4 compartments. And you can see in the case of Romania, the one with all the red, Romania is essentially the whole country is closed or on the worst ASF rating, and I'll show you the outbreaks are still very active in Romania. So that's really the hot spot, but still having activity in these other countries as well. What is it? It's 4.4 million tons of pork production out of Europe's 24 million produced that are ASF positive as we speak, so 20% of their production. And Poland, Hungary, Belgium, these were and or are big exporters. So those are the really important as far as the trade front that are infected. And of course, most importers, once these European countries broke, they banned all imports immediately. So that's sort of precedent warning for us. And so this is January. These are cases, just for the 4 months of January, and the red dots are wild boar. And they probably don't really show up, but the purple little star things are domestic. So you have like 1 or 2 cases in Ukraine, and I think 1 case of domestic in Romania, no, a couple in Romania, 1 in Poland on the domestic, but most of that is wild boar cases just in January, and I have the numbers to the side if you're interested. But also in Belgium, still having those wild boar cases, 67 cases just in January in those wild boars in that little tiny region in Belgium. So obviously the debate of how did it jump all the way to Belgium, the human vector, I think is what we've heard loud and clear. That's what we hear from the Europeans. Migrant workers, possibly truck drivers is what I hear the most. Infected sausages and sandwiches thrown in the waste, and that's right where those wild boar were found, is near this huge truck stop. I don't know, but creepy. And still very active, as you can see. And again, these are the cases. In 2018, the red is the wild boar, and so Poland having the most, But Romania really started to blow up kind of later in the year, and that's where the big domestic cases were found. And so more of a backyard style production, but they were having cases on big farms as well. So Romania has been clearly the hot spot on the domestic hog front. And so who are Europe's big exporters? We know obviously Germany. Spain has been the big growth. We've been hugely frustrated by Iberico pork. Like if we hear that word again, and but they've really just become hugely visible in all of the Asian markets. Although I did have to kind of chuckle in Korea, some consumer watchdog has found fake Iberico pork. So it was labeled as Iberico pork, and they did like the genetic testing. We're like, no, this is white pork. And so that's been a little bit in the press in Korea. But yes, Spain has been a force to be reckoned with, and that has continued. And I'll show you their production in a moment. But otherwise, Denmark, Netherlands, Poland, mostly shipping to U.S. and Canada outside of Europe, where they're a big market at the moment. France, UK, Ireland, Hungary, and then others. And if we look at what's happening on the production in these countries, Germany is actually down. And Germany it's kind of a sad case, but a case where they're being regulated. I won't say out of business, but regulations are costing them. They were the low-cost producer, partly because of labor, which you may have heard. But environmental and other regulations have now come to Germany, and it's having an impact. Spain is now the low-cost, vertically integrated, very impressive model. They are the growth region, and that continues. Although we were hearing, Randy, in January from the European that now they have new labor laws that may raise their labor costs. So we'll see. But right now, Spain is the one in Europe that's really growing. And then in Eastern Europe, where everyone had expected this growth, now is where the ASF battle is. So it's certainly, I would say, slowed things down, although you see Poland's production was running up last year, and this is based on through October data and estimated to year end. Romania had like double-digit growth as well, so I don't know. It has to be a setback. But the bottom line here is that I expect Europe to have more pork to export this year, so they're not going away. We will have that competition, but again, China is going to need pork from everybody if the whole is what we think it may be. Europe, even though they've had ASF in Eastern Europe, they've managed to still, because ASF broke in 2014 in Poland, and so you see their exports have continued to grow. What happened when they got ASF? Their big loss was Russia. So Russia, who obviously has ASF, banned the entire European Union when it was found in Poland. I didn't think they would actually do it. I didn't think it would sustain, but January 2014 banned, and you see they're gone. Obviously, they're under the Politico embargo for now anyway as well. But Russia erased, and that just forced all that European pork into our markets, into all of Asia. And that trend has continued, and China by far is their biggest market. You can see here they're off that 2016 peak, but I expect them to be able to ship again and beyond that 2016 number into China. And the European producers, I mean, the European that we had, Antonio, was just chomping at the bit for that China buying to ensue. And Europe's prices are low. So again, like I said, U.S. market seems like it's kind of waiting. European market definitely. I have Spain here. The national or the EU average looks the same. Prices are low. Basically, they are at the low level of last year and below the kind of normal previous 5-year average. Again, risk for their production. They had also, last year with low prices, they had high feed prices. Producers can't have been making money, so it's been a difficult situation. So I think if they didn't have the China light shining out there, we could possibly see a reduction in European production. But I just have this sense that they're holding on, knowing that there is going to be a need for their product. Piglet prices have started to tick up a little bit, which is a possibly a sign of optimism, but you can see they're still quite low. As well, which again, high feed prices with drought, and then of course ASF concerns. There's a lot of, you can argue, headwinds for expanding. Okay, just touching quickly on Brexit because I gave up trying to sort out what might actually happen. But there's massive pork trade. UK imports, which are virtually all from the rest of Europe. US does a little bit of business to Europe, tiny little bit, and that's all to the UK. We are a net importer of pork from the UK. what was the number, like $60 million we'll bring in, or we brought in last year. We brought in close to $500 million of European pork, Poland being the biggest, but UK, I want to say it was 60 million. But yeah, mind-blowing. We're a net importer of pork from the UK at the moment. But most of their trade is with the rest of Europe, and that's $2.5 billion roughly of UK imports, again, from Europe, and then their exports to other EU markets, because that's mostly where they export, although they do have exports to Hong Kong, China as well. So the gap there is about 2 billion net imports of pork into the UK. So the hiccup here is that if there's a hard Brexit, WTO bound rates outside of quota or even in quota, tariffs are extremely high. And so in quota, it's only like 35,000 ton quota, the biggest one, which does nothing as far as their trade, 250 euros per ton. Out of quota is astronomical. So something will have to be done to negotiate new duty-free quotas for access, which would be for everyone. It would have to include the U.S. They can't just say, well, this is for Europe, it's for all trading partners. So if there's a hard Brexit, things could get interesting. We would have to still meet European requirements, so pork for the EU program. But again, if there's a hard Brexit, the UK is going to have to import product to meet their needs, and they're going to have to do something about their tariff schedule, because the WTO bound rates trade is not happening with Europe nor with the rest of the world. So something to just sort of keep your eye on, because it could get wild. And the UK-US trade agreement, we have USTR published negotiating, or the desire to negotiate, and requested input on negotiating mandates. And we submitted comments, as did everyone else. NPPC testified, and we'll see. But in my mind, their relationship with the rest of Europe will dictate whether they can adopt science-based import requirements, because they have to trade with Europe. And so that's my fear, I guess, if you will. That's my rational concern, is that the relationship there was going to supersede what they will accept from us. Canada, just quickly to show that the shift that has happened is that they're doing more to Japan, our number one market, more to Mexico, because we have that tariff. So you're probably familiar, the Canadian hog producers were up in arms this past year because they got hit by our market, by our tariff hit market, while their exporters were able to ship to Mexico by raising their price 15-20% to close that gap with our tariff. But the hog price tied to the U.S. market was terrible, right, because they did get hit. So it's been kind of, a wild ride for Canada. But production basically constrained growth in their overall exports, and so you did see a shift into the markets that were willing to pay. And for the U.S., we're waiting for year-end data, so by hopefully the 19th we'll actually know. But basically, U.S. exports still eked out a record last year despite all of the challenges, so pretty impressive. And there's a bit of a silver lining, right? So we'll talk about the loss in price and value in a moment. But you see this widespread growth. I mean, this is actual tonnage increase, and this is just through September. But again, because I'm waiting on those year-end data. But the tonnage increase is all I'm showing here, year on year. Korea has been our big growth market, which we'll finish with. But South America, Southeast Asia, so again, Philippines being a big driver here, Central America, Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, Mexico, growth across basically all of the world except for China. And so this is the same slide. It's just showing the trends through the same period in 2017. And so we saw the continued growth that we were on, that same trend that we were on in 2017, spilled over into 2018, which is what we expected pre-tariffs. But you see Mexico, we should have seen, and I had forecast similar growth into Mexico again last year. There was no reason why we shouldn't have done that. So that's loss, number one. China, we knew was going to be slow again, but it should have been on a similar slowdown as the year before, not this huge drop that we saw, 40% decrease. And that, again, is tariffs. So that's your impact on trade volume. And your bigger impact is on prices. And so when we did analysis on what these tariffs meant, we really focused on the hit to prices, because these markets take specific items. The reason that we export is to add value to every pig you produce. And so when you take these markets away, you take that bid away, the product goes somewhere, but it goes at a lower price. In the case of Mexico, we don't have another market for those bone-in hams. If China had been buying this past year and didn't have its own tariff, it might have looked different. But when you hit hams with tariffs in China and Mexico, two biggest foreign markets, Mexico and China, you see that drop immediately in the ham primal value. And so it was almost exact, which was kind of ironic. But 20% tariff in Mexico drove that ham primal down an average of 19%. If we look at June to December compared to the year before. And you can say, well, we produced more, yes, but the year before we produced more and prices held. And so I firmly believe this is a tariff impact. And that's a drop of $6.63 per head. That's just the loss in the ham value equated to per head. And picnics, it's another $3.32. So just your ham and picnic loss, $9.95, nearly $10 a head. The variety meats are huge, and it's hard to get yield on all of these products, let alone prices that we export to China. So it's difficult to capture the whole lost value. But if we look just at front and hind feet and picnic hocks, these products were trading at, in some cases, over $1 a pound, and that dropped, basically in half. So that loss per head, $1.80, just on those three items. You add in, everything else from snoot to tail that we send, and it's a bigger impact. So just on those, select items, if you will, $11.75 per head in lost value, call it. Actual drop in prices. Spread that across harvest over the same period, roughly $860 million lost to the industry. And so it's big, and I would argue that even possibly bigger or maybe harder to recover is our loss in market share. Mexico, our biggest market, they will take more. Our bone-in hams fit perfect in their processing machine, huge industry. It's exactly what they need. It's a lean product. They have the labor so they can bone out those hams. We can't handle them here. But now they're being forced to try to diversify because they don't know. And when we treat our trading partner like this, what do you expect? So I'll show you a slide on their imports from Canada and Mexico in a second. We're hard to replace, so it's been difficult, but it's really called into question our reliable supplier status, and that's what we worked so hard. You guys have worked so hard to build yourselves up as globally. So that's our concern as your international marketing body at USMEF. So Mexico's total imports were record large again last year. This is based on exporter data. And you can see we did remain the biggest supplier, but our market share dropped from 87 to 85%. And so every percentage point counts. And as Gerardo in Monterey says, Erin, they're taking the icing off the cake. So they're buying European bellies. Well, this past year, we really would have liked that belly business, right? Our belly prices weren't through the roof. And so it's little things like that that are making a difference and negatively for us. And if we look at exporter data, it was an even bigger loss in market share just over those months where we were hit. It was more like a 4 percentage point loss. So it is significant. Mexico's hog prices have also stayed strong. And you can see the spread there between U.S. and Mexican prices. Whoops. And Mexico's prices in pesos were actually higher than they were with PED. So, sorry, they're both blue lines. But the blue line with the stars was this past year. 2014 is the other blue line. So prices were higher than at PED levels for Mexico. What does that mean? They're expanding. Mexico is expanding production. And so we're also, in a sense, helping them build up their domestic industry, which had already been expanding. Sows were already being added, new plants are being built, but this just lit the fire. Plus you have TPP. They have CPTPP. Japan, high labor costs in Japan. Mexico's perfect. Add that labor in Mexico. And so investments are happening. They're happening right now to produce more of that value-added product in Mexico. And they know what their niche is. They're not the cheapest producer, but they can add value. And they can do that with their labor advantage. And so we've also, I would say, given them extra impetus to do just that. And here are the imports from Canada and Europe. So Canada kind of topped out at around just over 10,000 tons that they were maybe willing or able to ship at that higher ham price into Mexico. And then Europe, the buying was, it doesn't look that big, but again, those bellies coming out of Spain topped out around 2,000 tons a month. And then they used that duty-free quota, 350,000 tons. Mexico's kept it open, still trying to incentivize imports from non-FTA suppliers, i.e. not the U.S., and that's being used by Europe. Okay, we're going to touch quickly on Japan because I want you guys to be able to ask questions, and this is a lot of text, but basically when we were there in October, there's huge opportunity. The big Japanese companies, they see their high labor costs, they see their aging farmers, They had a whole range of estimates on what Japanese production will do after these trade agreements are now implemented. But basically everyone said it would decline over time. And they're looking to invest outside of Japan. They want to invest right here. They know that we have the natural resources, the production base, the expertise, the research, everything else. They want to invest here, but they have to know that we will be a trade agreement partner. They can't leave money on the table, as they say. Like, all of our competitors are now going to zero on all processed products, which I think is the most exciting part of this, because you could see Japan importing huge volumes of finished products, which is not the case today because these products are heavily protected by high tariffs. But we lose that. We lose out on that if we don't have a trade agreement. And this trade agreement can't take 10 years to hammer out. We're talking huge economies. It could be incredibly complex. Autos, of course, we know. But so the Japanese had come up with this tag idea, trade agreement in goods, let's get it done fast. Basically, taking the parts of TPP that we already negotiated, US, Japan, we already negotiated, and get it done. But my concern is on this side, and especially with our split Congress today. Look what's happened with USMCA. So, I don't know. I want to cry about this one. And our loss estimates are, $600 million within 5 years. I mean, a lot of the experts will tell you, like, it's going to happen faster. $1 billion a year and 10 years out. It is hugely concerning, and we just have to try to keep this front and center, that we need this yesterday. Japan's imports continue to be record large, and we are still the largest supplier, about 35% market share. And it's a complex market, and but chilled is our biggest share, so this is our big chilled market outside of North America. Those volumes were relatively steady last year. Frozen is a processing material. It's under the gate price. The trade has been minimalized because we can't ship frozen picnics at the cheapest price. TPP would have changed that. I think it would have really changed the ballgame. But the interesting thing, like I said, is on these processed products where tariffs are going to zero. Tariffs on chilled pork above the gate are already low. They're 4.3%. Now everyone else pays 2.2%. That'll go to zero. But the big change is on ground seasoned pork. That GSP category is 100,000 tons for us. It's $300 million. We pay 20% tariff. Our competitors are now at 16.6%. April 1, they'll be 13.3%. This is a processing ingredient for sausages. That's the sausage picture. We'll lose more market share, and I'll show you what's already happening. And then other processed is small. It's even smaller than that if you back out some variety meats that are in there. And that's where the big potential is. We could ship bacon and ham, which doesn't go today because it has to hit an even higher gate price or lower minimum threshold price. But we will be out of that without a trade agreement. So Canada is taking chilled market share. We've already been up against this trend as retailers have diversified, where everyone had American pork. I want to do Canadian, and there's all arguments of why. The greater image. Canada has done a great job marketing. You have High Life's restaurant there. They've really positioned themselves as high quality, good nature, but it's also these retailers wanting to feature something different. So it's already been a battle, and now TPP is just going to give them that extra advantage. These are the tariffs, again, just phasing to zero on all processed products and to zero on everything coming in above the gate, and complicated for below the gate price, but it will transform Japan's imports and arguably their industry. Ground seasoned pork, so Europe has already been taking share. Again, this is ground picnics from the U.S. Shipped to Japan for import into their sausages. We used to dominate the market. We had 72% market share back as early as 2013. Europe has come in from nothing to 18% share. And there's investment going on in Canada. Canada's been the other big supplier, but in Canada, Mexico especially, Chile even to some extent, but Mexico again is that labor advantage. And in other parts of Europe. So Ireland has come in just this past year and started doing a ton of products. So you can see these new countries in Europe coming in as they've invested in the technology and the processing. Okay, we're going to just finish quickly on Korea. And Korea had record imports last year. As you saw, this was our biggest growth market. Our market share increased from 31.6 to 35%. We were the big driver. Their imports from the U.S. were up 30%, total volume up 17%. This is a big picnic and butt market for us, and it's just frankly been phenomenal. And one of the interesting things in Korea, it's all about consumption. So they're actually producing more pork in Korea. Slaughter was up over 4% last year. It'll be up 2% or more this year because they're making a lot of money because they have high hog prices and they have cheap feed imports from the U.S. And so it'll grow again. But you saw that FMD they had 3 cases. It's all in cattle and dairy, but they did have FMD outbreaks last week. It happened last year and didn't really have an impact, some on movement and short-term supply disruption, but we'll see, just something to keep an eye on. Maybe a total non-factor, but FMD is still alive and well in Korea, even though they try to vaccinate against it and get it under control or out. But it's been a consumption story. So growth in total imports, growth in imports from the U.S., growth in domestic production, but still a little bit of a decrease in self-sufficiency because imports are accounting for a bigger share of consumption. The other underlying thing here is that Korean importers have bought watching ASF and knowing they're trying to get supply while they can. So we know there are some inventories in Korea, and they're probably trying to be smart and have product, but this could mean a softening in our growth, just depending on what happens. So just keep that in mind. But we do expect continued record imports into Korea, regardless, because of the strong consumption growth. And it's just amazing. I mean, this is just one concept, but this is where we've had huge penetration, is this home meal replacement. It's a major convenience market. As you know, Koreans work incredibly hard, although the government has mandated a cutback in working hours. So they have a little bit more time to drink beer and have anju, or these snacks for drinking. And still, they still want convenience, though. They still don't necessarily want to cook. And so things like bungs and intestines and these products that have no value here, $3 a pound for bungs, it's amazing. So the growth in variety meats in Korea will stick because they're an ingredient in these products. So it's not just been a one-off thing. Like, they are ingredients that have stuck in these home meal replacement, in that case, snacking items. But the convenience side of this is just fascinating, and the convenience stores are lower quality than like in Japan, but they're even trying to upscale a little bit, and so that's kind of a whole nother unpenetrated segment that's getting a bit exciting as they add some bento boxes and sandwiches. Sandwiches are also a craze. So more growth in Korea. We are the perfect product. Our butts, picnics, and bungs fit perfectly into processing. Europe is the other big supplier, but that's mostly single rib bellies, although we do see Spanish product competing with us across basically all cuts. And so, in summary, obviously another wild year. Forecasting, just, I don't know, Christine, throw the dice. It's crazy, but diseases and tariffs, things are out of our control. So forecasting those is really impossible. U.S. exports will be record large this year again. But the degree to which we benefit, i.e. prices, is going to depend on our trade policy and tariffs. And everyone is just chomping at the bit to sell more to China. I think the caution there is that your big China buy might not happen until 2020. If we look at it, I guess, from a numbers or a forecasting standpoint, they may not come in big until late this year. Mexico's pork industry is growing. Watch out. They're obviously still our biggest market, but they're a competitor as well. And that will continue with their trade agreement benefit. And then Japan, we need the agreement now. And we just need a level playing field. I can't be more clear about that. Don't try to get fancy. Get what we already agreed with them in TPP. We can do the business. We just need the agreement. So I think, oh, yes, and our grain study, if anyone wants more specific details, and Sam we can talk to, but we've just updated our indirect export study, and so we have our Minnesota-specific handout, and we have all the national details are on our website. You can also let me know if you need anything more specific. But it's a pretty simple story. I mean, we know we're producing record volumes in this country, arguably because of exports. There's only so much we can consume here. Our consumption is growing. Thank God we have an awesome domestic market. But we need the exports, and that's what this growth industry is built on. And so we're able to feed more corn and distillers and soybeans through growing production bound for the export market. So adding more value in the U.S. So from some of our team, at least, that were together in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago, we thank you for your continued support, and buckle up because it's going to be a wild year of the pig. But I would be more than happy to talk with you all, take any questions. So thank you.